Hello. Thank you for joining me in this session. My name is Kiran Kupa. I'm a senior migrations and modernization SA with AWS. I hope it's safe to assume that you are in this session because you are either in the middle of a migration or you have a planned migration very soon. Over the past few years, I had an opportunity to be part of many migrations. And working through these migrations, I've seen that there are many points during the migration journey where you have to make many technical decisions. Some of these technical decisions are straightforward, but some essentially need additional consideration. In this session, we will take a look at some of the technical decisions to be made in the early phases of migration that are important for your successful migration journey. So here is what a typical migration journey looks like. After identifying your migration drivers, we move into the environment assessment phase, where we have multiple activities such as TCO analysis or build dependency mapping and to know your environment a little better. Once you have a good idea of the scope of work that you are working on, then we essentially move into the mobilize phase, where essentially it splits into two different tracks that can be run in parallel. Building of your infrastructure, which is infrastructure setup phase, and the other one would be the creation of application migration wave plans. Once you have these two things in place, you start with the actual workload migrations, where most customers take the path of lift and shift into the AWS cloud for a very quick win and then modernize inside the AWS cloud. Some of the drivers for this path is if you are working against a timeline where you have to exit your data center or a colo. But some of the customers essentially take the path of modernizing as they go into the cloud. This essentially extends the migration timelines that you're working with. And there are a bunch of different other activities that have to be performed during the cutover, during the post-migration, and there is always room for further optimization and modernization in the cloud. So in this presentation, we will specifically discuss about the technical details that have to be made during the assessment phase and also through the infrastructure setup phase of the migrations. Again, remember that migrations are complex and long-term engagements. Good planning and the ability to think ahead are always the keys to a successful migration. So throughout this presentation, we will take a deeper dive into the technical decisions you have to make during the different phases of your migration journey. We will talk about the idea, we will talk about why this idea is important, and what options do you have and how do you make those decisions. As of the agenda, we will cover the following areas. We will take a look at the discovery process and the decisions that have to be made in the discovery process. Then we will take a look at how to build the foundations the right way with different perspectives such as governance, networking, security, operations, data and analytics workload, and automation. Since these essentially fundamentally affect the way that you're building your foundations, let's take different perspectives. And we will put these perspectives into action by using some of the sample architectures that we will go through as well. So since this presentation is all about choices and decision making, let me introduce to you a concept of a one-way door and a two-way door decisions. A one-way door decision is one which it would be very costly to reverse if we find out that we are wrong. So it deserves additional consideration and very careful consideration. The two-way door on the other hand, or two-way door decision on the other hand, is where you can make a quick decision because we can simply turn around and leave if we don't like what's on the other side. Now, applying the same concept to the migration journey, there are technical decisions that have to be made along the way, and there are some of them which are fairly straightforward and easily reversible, but there are other considerations for two-way door decisions or one-way door decisions. Again, also remember with cloud adoption, many things are incremental in nature as well, where we want to start small and expand on the AWS platform. But always remember that we want to have a robust mechanism that can essentially scale. So the idea is we want to build the foundations the right and robust way. And we also want to make sure we identify what is important now and what can be built eventually. So let's begin this discussion with the discovery process. So once you decide to migrate the workload, it is imperative that you need to understand what are you dealing with in terms of applications and dependencies. This step is extremely important to reduce the risk of breaking those applications during the process of migration. There are many tools that are available out there in the market that will provide you with a rich level of details, such as server-to-server dependency mapping, application-to-database dependency mapping. If you're looking at application-to-application dependencies in case of multiple applications working together, you need to understand what the storage dependencies are, and legacy systems, networking connectivity dependencies, to understand how your applications are talking with each other or across the network or across the firewalls. And then you might have other API dependencies as well. Now, picking a wrong tool at this stage will essentially cause you additional burden of manual discovery that has to be done at a later stages. Or even worse, you might end up deploying a secondary or tertiary tool if you think that what you already have is not sufficient for your migration journey. So let's talk about how do we pick this discovery tool and how do we use this. So out of the many tool options that are out there that you can choose from, we need to find the right fit that essentially meets your needs. It really depends on the workload that you're dealing with. If it's an entire data center migration, there are tools for that specific reason. And if you're looking at very specific workloads such as containerized workloads, then you need to pick those specific tools as well. So the first consideration is the agent versus agentless tools. So most of the tools out there today come in both forms, agent or agentless. And depending on the feature set of that particular tool, you might gather more or less information from agent versus agentless depending on the vendor. The next thing that we want to understand is whether your tool can understand the storage discovery, whether it can discover your shared storage systems, where it can understand what kind of network attached storage is available on for your applications and so on. The next question is, will the tool or can the tool discover the databases as well? So it's not just about the databases, it also needs to understand the type of database, the specific type of database, the version of the database, the licensing, and so on. The next question is, will the tool be able to discover licenses for you? And in terms of not just the operating system licenses, but also application level layer license and also database layer license. Can it discover containerized workloads? If you have many containerized workloads inside your data center, can this specific tool go and understand the container workloads and discover the data for you and build the dependency map? And there might be many legacy systems such as mainframes or even less common operating systems such as AIX and Solaris that essentially have to be discovered. And once this data is discovered, where does the tool store the information in? Is that information stored in your data center, or is it essentially making ad hoc call and sending it outside your network? And is your InfoSec team okay to open those ports for that data transfer? So these are some of the decisions that you have to make when picking a particular tool. So to help you decide, we recently launched this prescriptive guidance page that can help you make those decisions very easily, where you have different options to choose from, and you can pick a particular tool that essentially fits your workloads. So here are some actual customer migration engagements that I worked on very recently. So there was a retail customer who was in the process of getting out of a colo and migrating to AWS. During the initial discovery phase, they skipped doing the discovery on shared dependency mapping of the databases and network dependency mapping. This kind of happened in a rush of things. So this essentially resulted in constant hurdles of dealing with unknowns throughout the migration journey. The scope of work turned out to be inaccurate. The migration turned out to be a lot more complex than initially thought, and the timelines had to be readjusted, and the additional functionality testing had to be implemented for many applications because we didn't want to end up breaking the applications. So in this process, they essentially lost many weeks overall. And another customer example, working with a healthcare customer who was essentially working on exiting a data center, the database licensing discovery and operating system licensing discovery were skipped. And essentially, this resulted in a huge difference in the total cost of ownership. And depending on the enterprise agreements, we ended up changing a few things to reduce the cost for the customer. We ended up switching to open source databases. We ended up re-architecting some parts of the solution to optimize for cost. And then there were many vendor contract implications that we had to work through, which essentially caused a lot of frustration during the process. So again, the gist of this slide is the customers that are running dependency mapping tools during assessment phase can plan and execute their migrations more effectively, saving days to weeks, and more importantly, reduce risk of breaking the applications during the migration process. So let's move on to the next phase of the journey, to the mobilize phase, where we will talk about infrastructure setup and the decisions we have to make in that process. So before building a foundations, we need to build a team that essentially has the right composition of skills and needs. In an organization, there may be many stakeholders that essentially build and manage your environment. Depending on your organization layout, again, this may be one specific team or many different teams that are spread out. Remember that everyone is a stakeholder in this game. If you don't have the needed representation from every team, you will end up with an incomplete architecture, and this will only lead to unwanted patchwork at the later stages, and we want to definitely avoid that. I've seen this happen in many scenarios, especially with large migrations and large enterprises, where teams are fairly isolated, and not having the right representation will result in many iterations of your architecture. And as a best practice, from AWS, we recommend that you build a cloud team or a cloud centers of excellence team. And if you're wondering how to build this team, we essentially have a detailed white paper that is published out there with prescriptive guidance on what this team composition should look like. Now, the idea is this will essentially help you be more agile, reduce blockers through the migration process, and avoid friction during and after the migration in terms of operations. And so it's fairly important. Now, let's go deeper into the infrastructure setup. So let's start with this question. Do you have a landing zone? If the answer is no, then yes, of course, we're going to go and build one. But if the answer is yes, the follow-up question is my landing zone robust enough to handle the workloads that are going to come in the future? So this question is relevant to both a simple single application migration to an entire data center exit migration as well. Now, this will lead to infrastructure design and scaling conversations, which are spread across multiple areas, such as governance, networking, security, partner solutions, that you want to use, what type of SaaS connectivity you need, what operations model, and what automation you want to put in place. So let's take these focus areas and dive a little further and in depth. So most of these times, these discussions have to go much deeper than we think. So with any technology component, the devil is always in the details. So remember the concept of one-way door and two-way door, and always remember what should go first and what can be built later. So these topics can be further broken down into multiple focus areas or sections, and you can run them as an individual or combination of workshops to come up with a finalized architecture and get a final landing zone. So talking about these in terms of governance, the first task is usually about how many regions and how many accounts should I use. If I use multiple regions and multiple accounts, what is the account strategy that I'm going to maintain, and how do I maintain these accounts on an ongoing basis? Disaster recovery and high availability for your applications is a super important idea that you need to start talking early on. Cost management, again, super important in terms of governance. Moving on to networking is usually the second layer of your foundation. Not getting this right means you will end up spending more time fixing and moving your workloads around at a later point. So it is important to have a good connectivity between your data center and AWS. Think through the IP planning, DNS planning, VPC planning, network security tooling, and so on. When it comes to security, it's an ongoing process. You will have to make decisions around what kind of identity and access management setup you want, what tools you want to use in the process, what about logging and monitoring, how about firewalls and network security and automation, and various different things that you need to think about. Most companies today have some form of SaaS applications, so you need to think about how you want to connect to those SaaS applications going forward in the cloud. You need to build your operations model, and you also want to build some form of automation with certain tools, and you need to pick and choose tools which you are good at and where your users are already familiar with. And throughout this process, there will be room for multiple different partner solutions. If you're using them on-prem, you want to bring the same solutions to AWS platform, then you need to understand how these solutions will fit into the cloud operations and even the cloud architecture. Again, the end goal of this entire exercise is getting an output, which essentially is a landing zone that is ready to accept your workloads. Now, at this stage, we recommend that you follow AWS well-architected framework to guide through all your decisions. So just make sure that you read up on the well-architected white paper as well. So when it comes to governance, the first decision that has to be made in building a governance model is a multi-account strategy. So when you start in the cloud, most customers start with one single account. But as the workloads grow, as the number of accounts grow, then you need to decide how many accounts do I need. And since the accounts are the ultimate boundary for your resources, you need to identify where you want to consolidate and where you want to isolate. And the next decision that you have to make is that how many regions should I use? This really depends on your business customers, your end users, your data locality needs, your business continuity model, and so on. Disaster recovery in HA is primarily dictated by your application. So you need to understand what kind of resources that will go in place. So you have to make those technical decisions in that process. And then finally, given the dynamic and scalable nature of the cloud, you need a mechanism to identify the cost management. And if it could be as simple as leveraging AWS alerts, or maybe use a different budgeting tool that can help you in the process. So you might ask me a question, why do we need multiple accounts? Again, you may have many different teams. You can group these workloads based on your business purposes and ownership. Accounts are natural boundaries or for your resources where you can essentially apply very distinct security controls across your environments. Costs are also incurred usually at an account level. So if you want to isolate by cost management, then you can have separate accounts just for the billing purposes. You can also deploy accounts based on your business processes, operations, regulatory needs, and budgetary requirements. And lastly, essentially accounts will help you isolate as well or reduce the blast radius. For example, a potential bug in one account will essentially not affect the other accounts inside your environment. I've seen scenarios where customers they want as many accounts as possible versus as less accounts as possible. And the answer really depends on how your business is laid out and how your organization is laid out and who is willing to support those resources. All right, so moving on, the next decision is what account should I create? Now I understand that I got to have multiple accounts. Now what account should I create? So there are two primary categories of accounts. It's based on the functionality. The first one is the core accounts, and then you have something called the workload accounts where the actual workloads go in. So in terms of core accounts, you could have different accounts such as an organizations account which will help you with policy management and billing. You could have a security account where this will be an account which essentially is hosting all your security related services. Then you have a log archive account where you can aggregate all the logs from different accounts so that you can have some form of archival and some kind of visibility process for your logs. You could have a network account where you can put all your network devices inside this particular account, which will essentially decide what the ingress, egress traffic is going to look like and so on in your multi-account strategy. And then you may have shared services accounts, which will essentially help you host services such as Active Directory, file shares, patch management tools that are essential for managing that are shared between multiple different business units. And then you can have multiple sandbox accounts for testing of whatever you want to test inside AWS Cloud to help you with the agility. Now, when it comes to workload accounts, the questions that we need to answer here are, does each of my workload will get its own account? Does each application workload get its own account? Does each business unit get its own account? Does each environment such as dev, test, and prod get their own account? What about the regional accounts? Like, do I get an account based on a specific region because if I want to isolate by a region? And what if I want to have like each team will get its own burner account so that they can play around with? So the things that can essentially help you through this process are some of the things that you need to have a good understanding around. The AWS service soft limits and hard limits on different services that you're using inside these accounts. You need to understand the API rate limits, understand the overhead in the management that essentially comes with multi-account strategy. You need to understand the networking complexity that might come in as well. You need to have a good handle on the cost overhead because of the multi-account strategy. Then you need to understand what level of automation can you bring with the tools that you have if you go with multiple regions and multiple accounts. And then the ability to maintain consistency across all of these, and along with the operation support on who is responsible for managing and maintaining these accounts. Now, to give you a real quick customer example, I was working with a customer who essentially decided that they wanted to use one account per application per environment, which resulted in one account for application one dev, application one prod, and application one pre-prod, and so on. It was an awesome idea for isolation. However, what ended up happening was the overall cost of networking ended up being more than the workload itself. So this is where we had to jump back in and essentially work with the customer to simplify the account structure and reduce the overhead cost for the customer. Again, the result of multiple workloads and essentially is that you're going to get purpose-built accounts to essentially fit your business needs. This could be sandbox, pre-prod, dev, prod, burner accounts, shared accounts, application-based accounts, and this really depends on how your organization is laid out and how you're willing to support these different accounts inside AWS side. So now that we figured out how many accounts I need, if you're wondering how to create these accounts, then there are a couple of ways to do it. If you want to build the functionality from scratch with custom guardrails based on your needs, then you can take the option of a custom landing zone, which essentially is going to be a lot of cycles for you to build. Or you can leverage the option of AWS Control Tower that can essentially provide you with automated setup of a secure and well-architected environment. Again, our recommendation is to use AWS Control Tower as it makes it much more easier for you with all the built-in guardrails that come with AWS Control Tower. Again, bringing this all together, all these accounts together, you can simply use a service called AWS Organizations, where it has a construct called organizational unit, which has the capability of bringing all of these accounts together. You can combine these accounts inside an OU, and you can apply something called as a service control policy around these OUs for better governance. So at a high level, it would look like you have a management account, and then you have multiple accounts based on your business needs and business units along with AWS best practices. And you at the bottom you have a policy staging account, which will help you attach and detach policies and play around to play around the policy management before you put them into production. So this is a sample from one of my recent customer engagements where we were building an account structure based on the parameters the customer provided us. It was a multi-day engagement with the customer. We took a lot of time to understand the isolation boundaries, the business boundaries, the shared application, service, and workloads from the customer side. The final product was something that we can fit in today's customer's need and also set a standard and leave room for growth so that making it more robust. So in this scenario, the account structure ended up as having a core OU, which had like core accounts. Then we had a bunch of application specific accounts. Then we had service specific accounts, depending on different services within on the customer side and on the shared services. Then we had multiple sandbox accounts for different teams. Then we ended up with accounts based on business units because that's how the organization on the customer side was laid out. And then we ended up having a shared business unit OU where there were applications that were shared across business units and also in different market segments that the customers that the customer services. So essentially, this is again, this could look very complex or very simple depending on your organization layout. So let's jump into the discussion of networking decisions that have to be made. So again, since networking is an underlying fabric on which everything is built, it really warrants for a very careful consideration. Some of these decisions in the networking area are one-way door decisions. So things like CIDR block overlap, the traffic routing patterns, and these are the things that will essentially need additional careful consideration. So when it comes to networking, the first and foremost thing is you want to decide how you want to connect to your data center, what your data center connectivity is going to look like. Do you have a good IP planning? That is a technical decision that you have to make in that process. You need to decide on the type of connectivity, whether you're going to do a VPN connection or you want to spend a little more extra money for a direct connect depending on your business needs. Then if you're using a multi-account networking, then you need to identify how that works. And how in a multi-account strategy, how does the networking aspect work and what are the resources that can be shared? So there are services like AWS Resources Access Manager that will help you share resources between multiple accounts in that networking model. Again, coming to multi-region networking, it's important to understand that how you want to connect these multiple regions that you're using, whether you want to use direct connect gateway service or you want to use transit gateway peering, and there are different other options that are available. You need to understand what kind of VPC to VPC connectivity that you want to use, having VPC peering or transit gateways. Since you are combining data center and AWS platform at the same time, you need some form of DNS resolution going back and forth that has to be set up. You need to think about the east-west, north-south traffic patterns on how the traffic ingresses and egresses out, what kind of traffic filtering that you want to put in place. There might be many partner tools in the process, such as Palo Alto's and Cisco's, that you're already used to, that you want to bring into AWS platform. You need to understand how these tools are going to play along with the other services on the AWS side. So they have their own best practices. And finally, if you need external vendor connectivity, such as B2B, B2C, remote office locations, or SaaS provider connectivity, then you need to make those decisions as much as possible, as quickly as possible. This is a sample high-level architecture diagram. Again, this is a 10,000-foot view architecture sample of one of my recent customer engagements. If you double-click on these, I'm sure there are many finer details that I'm going to skip in this presentation. But at a very high level, this customer essentially had like 2 data centers, and they wanted to connect to the cloud with a multi-region and multi-account strategy. So the initial setup was something like they were using Direct Connect and a fallback VPN to reduce the cost, and then essentially connected with a DX gateway so that they can have multi-region connectivity. And then once they hits the region, essentially a transit gateway is helping you branch out into multiple different VPCs and connect them together. And since this was a multi-account, essentially everything came together. Again, the gist of this is, remember that you will be in the hybrid period for a long time when you're migrating, which means that this essentially needs to be production grade. So going deeper into the security decisions. So again, remember, security is an ongoing process. Many customers already have some or most of the security controls applied in their data centers. Migrating into the cloud, you can essentially bring those same controls, or maybe you can essentially change to the AWS native security controls that will provide you with a lot more automation of security inside the AWS cloud. So the first and foremost thing is identity and access management on how you want to connect. Understanding least privilege access model is super important. Understanding how do you want to federate, how do you want to enable SSO, and things like that. Again, there is prescriptive guidance available for different phases as well. Be sure to take a look at our prescriptive guidance solutions that are available online. When it comes to detection, we want to enable detection at all different layers. Think of this as layers of onion, where you want to have anywhere from the edge of the network to the servers, to the applications, to the data layer. Talking about data, again, infrastructure protection can be applied at many different layers as well, where you have perimeter security, network security, system security, application security, and these are the things, or these are the decisions that you have to make early on inside your migration journey to make sure that you're putting the right controls in place. In terms of data protection at rest and transit, super important. You understand what tools you want to use for management of keys, who's going to own the keys, who's going to manage the keys, and so on. You need to build an incident response system with detective controls and protect and auto remediation as much as possible. Then the compliance is, again, a very fundamental thing around security, where it is very subjective to the line of business that your application is in or what your needs are. And then there will be a lot of partner tools that you want to bring from your on-prem data center. But the idea is to use as much as you want, but also try out the cloud native services so that they can give you that additional automation that we can provide in the cloud. Many times, coming to the operations, many times we ignore the operations aspect of things during and after the migration. Operations process and team layout usually has a very big impact on the way that your multi-account, multi-region, and networking architectures are supported. The first and foremost thing is you want to understand how your teams are laid out. You want to build a RACI or a responsibility matrix. And this is probably the fundamental construct that you need to understand for smoother transition when you go into the cloud for operations. Then you want to build the other processes like ITIL integration. You want to build your runbooks, escalation paths, cost management, patch management, backup DR, change management. There are so many other things that you have to consider in terms of operations. So to give you a quick example, I recently worked on a customer engagement where this customer had shared infrastructure, which was supported by 2 different operations teams. So when we onboarded all these accounts, we took one of the operations team and we designed everything. And when the second operations team came along, the problem was they fundamentally did things very, very differently than the first operations teams. So we had to go back and redo multiple things, such as we had to redo the CloudFormation templates, change the alerting mechanisms, bring in different tools because they had different tool sets altogether. So this essentially, what happened was this essentially caused too much unwanted friction and essentially delayed the go live by over 4 weeks. So it's very important to understand the operations foundations and make those decisions as quickly as possible. Data analytics is one of the most common workloads in any company today. Most of the customers have some form of data analytics workloads, and the account layout and the architecture will change quite a bit depending on your data analytics workloads. So it depends on where the data is produced from, where the data is stored, whether it's stored locally in each of these own accounts, or if the data is centrally located in one single account. Then you have your data consumers on the other hand, or depends on who's consuming the data and how they're consuming the data. It could be like BI tools, it could be Hadoop clusters, it could be AI/ML tools that are consuming the data. So you need to understand what are these different tools that are consuming the data. Now, based on that, it's also important to understand what your data transfer tools are and what the tool capabilities are. Because if you are willing to move the data across multiple different accounts over the network, you need to understand what limitations and what methods do you want to use. And finally, the data transfer cost will play a big role in the data movement. You don't want to be copying terabytes of data across accounts every single day. So you need to understand the data generators and producers and make sure you consider that into your multi-account strategy. So this is again a sample pattern of a data lake where you have the line of business producers on the left-hand side and you have line of business consumers on the right-hand side. And in the center, you have enterprise data lake account where you're essentially using enterprise lake formation as a solution. Now, this could change drastically where you could have maybe 2 line of business generating data, but you might have 10 consumers on the other side. Or maybe you have a need to process the data locally inside each account. So that really depends on the workload and what you're trying to achieve from your workload side. And finally, having consistency across the environments is super critical. Again, you need to understand what the operating model is, who is responsible, how it is done. you need to ensure that there is some form of drift detection that is enabled. And if you don't have the drift detection, you can enable it in various different ways. It can be using Control Tower for account onboarding and creation. It could be using CloudFormation for infrastructure or Terraform. You need to make a choice on what tool you have to use and what skill set does your teams possess, so that it can be easier for you going forward. You can also apply various different configuration management tools. If you already are working with tools like Chef and Ansible, then you essentially need to identify those technical details and implement them. And as much as possible, try and put a CI/CD pipeline across or between the accounts and environments so that you can have some level of consistency that can be built so that all your accounts are consistently secure and our accounts are consistently secure. Again, we understand that migrations are complex and long-term engagements. Good planning and the ability to think ahead are usually the keys for a successful migration. Any customer, large or small, any migration, large or small, it is important to build foundations the right and robust way. Identify one-way doors and two-way door decisions, and also identify what is important to be built right now versus what can be built at a later stages. Always leverage prescriptive guidance that is available to you, and we are always here to help. Again, since you joined the summit to learn, you can keep learning beyond this point or beyond this event with the resources available from our training and certification team. There's a variety of digital training, classroom training, white papers and guidelines that will essentially help you succeed with your migrations. Thank you for joining in this session.